The banner was stretched across the garage in red block letters, and it read, "Goodbye, Freeloader. Don't come back." I pulled into the driveway to get my last box. That's all I had come for, one banker's box in the laundry room with some old tax files and a pair of boots I liked. I had planned to be in and out in under 10 minutes, invisible and unremarkable, the way I had learned to move through that house. Instead, I found a party. The grill was smoking. Country music was coming out of a Bluetooth speaker someone had propped against the patio wall. There were people I recognized from the neighborhood, and some I didn't, holding beers and paper plates, laughing at something that turned out to be me. A voice from the patio, drunk, carrying too easily across the lawn, called out that a 30-year-old woman with no real career ought to be ashamed. Another voice yelled that my poor family had carried me long enough. Then something hit the side of my car. A hot dog. Someone screamed that that was my last free meal. Even the kids were pointing. My name is Ava Mitchell. I'm 30 years old. I had moved back into my father's house in Scottsdale, Arizona 3 years earlier to help save a business that was collapsing. And I had been saving it, quietly, invisibly, with my own money and my own labor and my own expertise, for every one of those 3 years. None of them knew that. Or rather, they knew it in the way that people know things they have decided not to acknowledge because acknowledgement would require them to rearrange their understanding of themselves. I stood in the driveway holding my keys so hard the teeth cut into my palm. I looked at the banner. I looked at my father in his grill apron, smirking like he was finally unveiling something long overdue. I looked at my sister Kelsey mid-laugh, not meeting my eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I walked inside, picked up the banker's box, walked back out, and took one photograph of the banner with everybody grinning underneath it. My father saw me take it. He smirked like I was taking a souvenir from the place that had saved me. I drove away without saying a word. 2 weeks later, my phone started filling with messages I never expected to see from him. "Talk to me. Please call. I'm begging you." By then, it was already too late. Let me tell you the version they told everyone, because that version matters. The version was simple and clean and humiliating in the particular way that people love because it lets them feel superior from a comfortable distance. I was 30, divorced before I ever married because the engagement dissolved 2 years before the wedding, working from a laptop, living in my dad's house, drifting, they said, floating, taking up space while real adults with real jobs and real exhaustion carried the weight of the world. That story played well at neighborhood cookouts and on Facebook threads where people type things like *tough love, and this will finally make her grow up from the luxury of their own fixed incomes and intact families. The truth was quieter and more useful to everyone in that house if nobody ever said it out loud. I had moved back to Scottsdale 3 years earlier because my father's sign company was dying. Mitchell Graphics and Install had been a real business once. My father, Gary Mitchell, had built it over 20 years. Commercial signage, storefront lettering, monument signs for office parks, vinyl wraps for business vehicles, trade show display systems for companies that needed to look bigger than they were. He had contracts with strip malls and regional franchises and a couple of small municipal accounts. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid, and it was his, and he was proud of it in the way that men of his generation are proud of visible, physical work. Then supply costs spiked. 2 large commercial clients paid late, one of them 4 months late, and the cash flow gap that opened up turned out to have very little margin underneath it. A project near Mesa got tangled in permit issues that ate 3 weeks of scheduled income. The bookkeeper he'd had for 6 years left abruptly for something else and handed off nothing clean. And then the thing my father always did when things got ugly happened. He got louder. He blamed his younger workers. He blamed the economy. He blamed the city's permitting office, which he referred to as a bunch of pencil pushers who had never done real work. He blamed his customers, immigrants, women in management positions, people who didn't understand what a dollar was worth. He never blamed the fact that he had been operating without a financial cushion, without clean receivables, without any system for tracking which accounts had actually paid versus which ones he was mentally crediting, because he needed the number to be okay. I came back because I thought it would be temporary. That was the lie I told myself, because the truth, that this was the beginning of years, was harder to carry from the start. I work as a freelance bid coordinator and operations consultant. I help small contractors, regional suppliers, and service firms organize vendor documentation, clean up proposal submissions, track deadline-sensitive projects, rewrite service scopes so they don't lose contracts over unclear language, and keep their back-end operations from falling apart before they can actually win the work thereafter. Most people hate this kind of work because it is invisible, unglamorous, and deeply uncomfortable for people who believe that real work has a physical signature, calluses, a uniform, a body that hurts at the end of the day. I am good at systems. I am good at seeing problems before they become emergencies. I am good at the kind of quiet, structural attention that keeps something from collapsing without anyone noticing it almost collapsed. That made me valuable to strangers. It made me invisible to my family. The first month back, I reorganized my father's invoicing system, which had been kept in a combination of a spreadsheet that hadn't been updated since the previous bookkeeper left, and a folder of paper invoices in a manila envelope that lived in the cab of his truck. The second month, I caught a missed municipal permit renewal that would have cost him a city account worth roughly $14,000 a year. The third month, I found that he had been remitting sales tax incorrectly on a specific category of vinyl product, and quietly corrected it before it could become an audit trigger. Then I found equipment leases set to auto-renew at rates that had been reasonable when they were signed 3 years earlier, and were now 40% above market. Then I realized that a significant portion of his receivables were phantom numbers, accounts he believed had paid because he had stopped following up and had filled the gap with optimism. Every time I fixed one thing, 2 more appeared behind it, like pulling rot out of drywall. You get the soft section, and then your knuckle goes through to the next one. He never introduced me to clients as the woman keeping his business solvent. He introduced me as, "My daughter, she's figuring some things out right now." When I handled a call at dinner that saved a project from imploding over a documentation error, he told the story later as if he had handled it. When I negotiated payment terms with a supplier who had been about to put his account on hold, he told his brother I mostly just answered emails and kept myself busy. When I covered a payroll gap one Friday, because he would rather have driven off a bridge than admit to his 3 installers that he couldn't make the direct deposits, he called it a loan and never mentioned it again. Weeks later, he told my grandmother that families don't keep score. That sentence, remember it. Families like his only say, families don't keep score when they're the ones running up the debt. I did not pay everything at once. That's the thing that kept it hidden. I paid the shortfall, the difference between what was due and what he had, the amount needed to keep the machine from screaming loudly enough for someone outside the family to hear, software subscription overdue by 60 days, utility balance on the company workshop that was getting close to disconnection, insurance reinstatement on one of the work vans after he let it lapse, rush shipping on materials when he forgot to reorder and a job was starting Monday. 3 vendor deposits that would have killed active contracts if they'd bounced. None of it was dramatic. All of it was necessary. All of it disappeared into the operation without leaving a visible trace of who had provided it, because my father processed my contributions the way he processed oxygen, as something that simply existed and required no acknowledgement. He hated that I worked from a laptop because he could not see the work. To my father, visibility was morality. If he couldn't watch you sweat, your labor didn't count. He would walk through the kitchen while I was on a call trying to prevent a contract cancellation worth $11,000 to him and say, very audibly, "Must be nice." He would make jokes at family dinners about my asterisk little computer hobby. Then, an hour later, he would come to my room and ask if I could rewrite a vendor response because he thought the client sounded angry and the wording wasn't landing right. He treated my competence like a household appliance, useful when activated, embarrassing to acknowledge. The rest of the family followed his lead. In families organized around one loud voice, contempt rolls downhill from whoever holds it. My sister Kelsey, 4 years younger, had learned early that mocking me earned approval from our father. It was the fastest route to being on the right side of him on any given day, and she had taken it so consistently that I think she sometimes forgot she was doing it. My Uncle Dean had attached himself to the company years earlier when his own life had stalled, doing installation work and occasional sales and weekend drinking that leaked reliably into weekdays. He had the particular belligerence of a man who knows he is not the most competent person in any room and covers for it with volume. My grandmother, our father's mother, lived nearby and visited constantly and wrapped every cruelty in scripture and stated concern. Nobody had to coordinate it. That's the specific genius of a toxic family system. Once the hierarchy is established, everyone performs their role without rehearsal. The only requirement is that the person at the bottom continues to absorb without complaint, because the moment they stop absorbing, the whole arrangement has to be renegotiated, and nobody wants to do that. What changed was not their opinion of me. I gave up on their opinion a long time before I gave up on the situation. What changed was something I overheard on a Friday night. My father was in the backyard with Dean and a neighbor. I was inside. The sliding door was cracked. I was not eavesdropping intentionally. I was getting water, but sound carries in a way that Arizona evenings don't muffle the way you'd expect. He was saying he was thinking about giving me 90 days to get out. That maybe hitting bottom would finally make a woman out of her. Dean laughed. The neighbor laughed. My father laughed. I stood there in the kitchen with my water glass and understood something that shifted everything that came after it. He believed his own myth. He genuinely believed he had been carrying me. He had absorbed the story so completely that the 3 years of hidden labor, the covered payroll, the fixed permits, the corrected tax filings, the renegotiated leases, none of it existed in his internal accounting. What existed was, he had provided a roof. I had received it. All of the rest was footnotes he had simply declined to read. He thought if I left, the only thing he would lose was the inconvenience of seeing me in the kitchen. I didn't confront him. I went to my room. I opened my laptop. And I started building the documentation that would become, 2 months later, the only version of events that was immune to his rewriting. People think revenge starts with anger. Mine started with spreadsheets. Not because I'm cold, because I know how families like mine operate. The second you cry, you're unstable. The second you raise your voice, you're disrespectful. The second you defend yourself with feeling, you've handed them the proof they need that your version of events is emotional rather than factual. Emotion in a toxic family is always weaponized against the person who shows it. So I built a record. Every payment categorized and dated. The payroll gap, amount, date, confirmation of the transfer. The insurance reinstatement, invoice, payment receipt. The vendor deposits, the utility balances, the permit fee, the rush shipping charges. I went back as far as I had records for and documented everything forward from there. The total, when I finished, was just over $47,000. Not an estimate, not a feeling. $47,000 itemized with documentation. I also built the business record. The receivables I had recovered, the accounts I had saved, the cost of the permit mistake I had caught before it became a loss, the tax exposure I had corrected before it became a liability. The conservative estimate of what those interventions had been worth to the company was over $120,000. I worked quietly at night for 3 weeks. My father did not know what I was doing because he never asked what I was doing. He had never asked what I was doing. Then I prepared the packet. I chose a Thursday because Thursdays were when my father did his banking, the routine that kept him out of the house for most of the morning. I waited until Dean wasn't there. Kelsey worked Thursdays. My grandmother did her weekly grocery run. I sat at the kitchen table, and I waited. He came in around 11. He was surprised to see me sitting there with a folder. He made a joke about whether I was finally doing some work. I asked him to sit down. Something in my voice made him do it without arguing, which told me I had the right tone. I told him I was leaving, that the box in the laundry room was the last of my things, and I would be taking it when I left. I told him I wanted him to have something before I went. Then I opened the folder. I walked him through the first section, the payments. He interrupted twice, both times to reframe. Once to call the payroll transfer a loan I'd offered. I had the text messages where he'd asked, not offered. Once to say the insurance situation had already been resolved without my help. I had the payment confirmation from my account, time-stamped. Both times, I put the documentation on the table without raising my voice. Both times, I watched him look at it. The second section, the business interventions, took longer. He pushed back harder because this was the territory where his ego was most invested. He had built that company. He had built it with his hands and his years. The idea that a daughter working from a laptop had been a structural support beam was not a narrative he had any interest in accommodating. I let him push. I let him say his version, and then I told him the numbers. The municipal account he would have lost without the permit renewal. The supplier who had been 4 weeks from putting him on cash-only terms until I renegotiated. The tax exposure on the vinyl product category. The auto-renewing equipment leases I'd renegotiated into savings of over $8,000 a year. He was quiet for a long time after the numbers. Then he said, I didn't know about some of this. I know, I said. That was partly by design. If I had told you every time, we would have had a fight about whether my work counted. This way the work just happened. He looked at the table. How much do I owe you? I'm not asking you to pay me back, I said. I'm asking you to understand what actually happened in this house. He looked up. Then what do you want? I put the last sheet on the table. A printed list, bookkeepers, a tax resolution service for the sales tax backlog, a small business attorney, a utility assistance program, 1 business credit counselor. Resources, I said. That's what I'm leaving you. I stood up. He said, if you walk out now, don't expect to come back when things turn around. I picked up my keys. Dad, the only reason things ever turned around in this company was because I was standing behind you pushing. You just never turned around to look. Then I picked up my box and I left. The collapse came in installments, the way it always does when the hidden support structure is removed. 3 days after I moved into a rented room in Denver, Colorado, a furnished place near the light rail that cost more than I wanted to pay and was the best money I had ever spent, my grandmother called. Not to apologize, to negotiate. She said everyone had behaved badly, which in family language means the person with documentation is being asked to distribute moral blame evenly among themselves and the people who caused the damage. She said she hoped I would come back for a calm conversation, like Christians. I asked her whether the banner had been Christian. She ignored that and moved to business. A work van had been sidelined because the insurance lapsed again. A client was withholding a final payment over a documentation issue. The company was struggling, and if it failed, the whole family would suffer. Then she used my mother. She said Mom would hate this division. That line used to crack me open. My mother had died when I was 19, and for years that specific lever had been able to stop me mid-sentence, shift my whole orientation, make me softer than the situation warranted. This time it didn't move. No, I said. Mom would hate that her daughter was publicly humiliated by people who lived off her work. My grandmother had nothing ready for that. We ended the call. Kelsey showed up at my apartment in Denver about 3 weeks after I moved in. She looked worn in a way I hadn't seen from her before, the specific tiredness of someone whose armor has stopped fitting. The polish she usually wore was gone. She came in and made small talk for a few minutes, which told me she was building toward something she didn't know how to start. Eventually, she said, the company is falling apart. She told me Dean had missed 2 shifts in a row. 1 printer had been sold for operating cash. The grandmother was furious about something involving money she had lent the business. My father kept saying everything could be fixed if I would just stop being stubborn. Then Kelsey said something that I hadn't expected from her. "I was awful to you," she said. "No excuse, I was just awful." Not performed. Not the kind of apology that's really a request. Just the sentence, flat and uncomfortable, sitting there between us. She told me the hot dog was disgusting, and she knew it in the moment, and had done it anyway because our father was pleased, and she had wanted to be on the right side of him for once. She told me the banner had been his idea, and Dean had helped hang it, and she had laughed because laughing felt safer than not laughing. Then she said the sentence that made everything click into a shape I could finally see from the outside. "When you were there," she said, "he aimed most of it at you. Now that you're gone," she stopped, "he's turning on everyone." That's the system, in one sentence. Toxic family systems stay stable by feeding one person to the tension. Remove that person and the pressure distributes. The family discovers that the cruelty was not a response to that one person's particular failures. The cruelty was the weather. It went wherever there was someone to land on. "Did you ever actually believe I was freeloading?" I asked her. She looked down at her hands for a long moment. "No," she said. "I knew you were helping, I didn't know how much. And if I admitted Dad was lying, everything in that house got scary. It was easier to go along." Cowardly, honest, human, not enough to undo anything, but more truth than I had received from anyone in that family in 3 years. I let her stay one night. We talked until late. We didn't fix anything. But we started something which was more than I had expected. My father, meanwhile, went in the opposite direction. He emailed me something titled * Family Resolution Proposal. It offered me a 90-day contractor role to help stabilize operations. It said compensation could be discussed once cash flow improved. At the bottom, in a line that I read twice to make sure I had understood it correctly, he wrote that this arrangement would also give me an opportunity to * repair trust. Repair trust. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote back 4 sentences. "I am not returning. I am not providing unpaid or deferred labor. Do not contact me for business support. Future communication should be respectful and personal only." His reply came within the hour. "So that's it. You just watch your father lose everything." I stared at that for a long time, because that had been the hook buried deepest in me my whole life. The hook that I had been trained to feel rather than examine. The idea that a parent's difficulty was a child's responsibility, that proximity to suffering obligated rescue, that walking away from exploitation was the same as causing harm. I wrote back, "You are not losing everything because I left. You are losing everything because you built a life that only worked while someone you treated with contempt kept carrying it in secret." He didn't reply. The house went on the market 2 months later. Not because my father wanted to downsize, because he had to. Kelsey told me. She sent one message, "The house is for sale." Then, a few days later, one more, "He keeps saying you ruined him." I wrote back immediately. I didn't ruin him. I stopped protecting him from what he built. Her response was 3 words, "I know now." Public records are brutally clean. I found the listing and then the closing record on the county assessor's site. The house sold below asking in late summer, which in the Scottsdale market at that time told its own story. The grandmother moved in with a cousin in Tempe. Dean was sleeping on someone's couch. My father rented a smaller place near the industrial section of the city, closer to the workshop, and tried to keep the company running with 2 accounts and one supplier who now demanded cash terms up front. I did not go back. I want to say that plainly, because I know what happens in stories like this. The ending everyone expects is the one where the person who left eventually returns to help one more time, because compassion requires it, because family requires it, because the most moral option is always the one that costs you something. I don't believe that anymore. My father's greatest mistake was not throwing the party. It was believing that the person he humiliated in front of the neighborhood would still want to keep his lights on afterward. Denver suited me. 1 contract turned into 2. 2 turned into a referral network. I formalized things into an LLC, started requiring deposits up front, built a client list of people who understood what they were paying for and paid for it reliably. I rented a larger apartment after 4 months, bought a used Subaru in cash, learned what dinner tasted like when nobody in the next room was manufacturing a crisis. The quiet was strange at first. Toxic families train you to distrust calm. They train you to read stillness as the pause before something breaks, to mistake peace for the absence of something you should be worried about. I had to unlearn that. It took longer than I expected. About 5 months after the house sold, my father called from an unknown number. The first thing he said was that he wasn't calling about money or business, which was how I knew he had thought carefully about what I would assume. Then he said he had found one of my mother's recipe cards while packing and thought I might want it. That was the first thing he had offered me in 3 years that didn't come wrapped around a demand. "You can mail it," I said. There was a pause. "Did you really think I was that cruel?" he asked. I could have answered that with 100 different sentences. I chose the most precise one. "Dad," I said, "you hung a banner over the garage." He exhaled, long and slow and very tired. He didn't say anything else. I didn't fill the silence. The recipe card arrived 4 days later. Chicken pot pie, in my mother's handwriting, on an index card that had been folded and unfolded enough times to be soft at the creases. At the bottom, in her specific handwriting, she had added a note: "Add extra time if Richard complains." I laughed so suddenly that I cried. The kind of cry that is more relief than grief, that comes when something you had braced against doesn't land the way you expected. I framed the card and put it on my kitchen windowsill. "Kelsey and I talk now. Carefully, the way you talk when you are testing whether honesty can grow in the place where competition used to live." She left Arizona too, got a steadier job in Albuquerque, built something smaller and more solid than anything she'd had before. She calls sometimes with practical adult questions, and I answer when I choose to. The choice, the fact that it exists, matters more than the answer. She never brought another hot dog incident up again. I didn't need her to. Some things you carry differently once you stop pretending they didn't happen. I still have the photograph. The banner in red block letters over the garage. The grill smoking. My father in his apron. Dean half-drunk on the patio. Kelsey mid-laugh. All of them certain they were documenting my humiliation, capturing the moment the freeloader finally got what she deserved. What they actually captured was the last second, before their safety net got in her car and drove away. I don't look at it often, but I keep it. Not as a wound and not as a trophy, exactly. More as a record. The same way I kept the business documentation, the same way I kept the payment receipts. Because families like mine survive by making you doubt your own memory, and the photograph doesn't lie. The last message I got from Dean came on New Year's Eve, about 8 months after everything. "You were right. No punctuation, no apology, just that." I didn't answer. People still ask whether I regret not helping one last time. The question sounds compassionate, but it's a trap, the same trap I grew up inside. It assumes the most moral person in a story is always the one who absorbs more, the one who sacrifices again, the one who decides that the need of the person who hurt them is more important than their own survival. I don't believe that anymore. If someone treats you as family only when they need your labor, your money, or your silence, they are not protecting a relationship. They are protecting a system. And if a whole household can laugh while you are publicly humiliated and then panic the moment your support disappears, that panic is your answer. The panic tells you exactly what you were. I was never the freeloader. I was the hidden payroll and the midnight fix and the buffer between chaos and the day someone outside the family finally saw what was actually happening. I was the person who covered the shortfall and corrected the filings and saved the permit and renegotiated the leases and wrote the vendor responses and kept the machine from screaming loudly enough to be heard. My father's greatest error was believing that the person he humiliated in public would still want to keep his business private. I drove away. I built a life that no longer needed his recognition to feel real. And on a Friday afternoon last fall, I sat in my apartment in Denver with my mother's recipe card on the windowsill and the afternoon light coming through at the right angle. And I made the chicken pot pie from memory, with extra time as instructed, and it was very good. I ate it at my kitchen table, alone and completely at peace. Some things take years to become what they were always going to be. I turned out to be one of them.